Excuse me.
No problem.
And welcome to the program. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. And my guest this segment is Alex Newman. Alex is with the New American Magazine. He's an investigative reporter. He's an author. He was the co author, along with the late Samuel Blumenfeld, of Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. Alex, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me, Charles. It's great to be with you again.
Now, the latest issue of New American goes deep into the issue of what is happening in our public school system, the war against God, the war against Western morality, the war against Judeo Christian ethics, the war against America. Um, I don't know where to start. You're doing a great job as sort of the inheritor of the late, great Sam Blumenfeld, a friend of both of ours, and his work, which spanned many decades, in exposing the conspiracy to use the school system in America, the public school system, to institute international socialism, and by doing so, by corrupting the morals and literally the brains of our young people. So, in that vein, let's go right to that and maybe give a little background on that.
Yeah, well, thank you, Charles. And this issue has been close to my heart since even before I started working with Sam. But when I started working with Sam on Crimes of the Educators, he brought me to the realization that this was the issue, right? Because it transcends all the other issues. You know, if we're going to protect our gun rights, if we're going to stop the slaughter of unborn babies, if we're going to keep our constitutional republic, if we're going to control the borders, you know, all these issues depend on having a well-educated citizenry that is capable of governing itself, that is capable of sustaining political liberty, individual liberty. And right now we are on the wrong track. So what we did at the New American is we produced this special report called Rescuing Our Children. We just released the second edition, which is updated. It includes some new articles and some updates to the previous articles, but it's kind of a very condensed all you need to know about the public school system in one easy tool. Our goal is to get out 1 million of them. And, we actually started working on this long before coronavirus, but then along comes coronavirus and shuts down virtually every public school in America,
Mhm.
liberating, 55 million children, at least for a time. And so we now have an unprecedented opportunity, Charles, to rescue millions of children, to get them into the safe sanctuary of good homeschooling programs, good Christian schools, good Jewish schools. And so the next battlefront now, as you know, up in New York, they're coming for the yeshivas. They want to shut them down
Yeah.
because they're not doing enough for this or that or the other. They're coming now for Christian schools as well. So that's going to be the next battlefront, is to preserve our educational liberty.
It's interesting, just as a note, that the coronavirus has had several positive byproducts, potentially positive. One of which is that the vast majority of Americans have left this rotten public school system, and that they're going to continue to stay out of it for the fall. And they are moving to homeschooling. I think there was just a survey done which said that 8 out of 10 Americans are thinking about homeschooling, and it's an opportunity to get homeschooling in front of people and help people begin to actually educate their children in the real sense, to think cognitively. The second thing that's happening is that because of the way the currency is set up, this could lead to the dissolving of the Federal Reserve System, because the U.S. Treasury, is taking over many of the functions of issuing currency. And the third thing, of course, is a little bit more natural, and that is that people in this country are becoming much more aware of basic survival tactics, what to do if we lose the infrastructure. How to have enough food and water in the house, how to have enough supplies to last a crisis, maybe of 4 or 5 weeks. Putting in canned goods, and just maybe psychologically also the idea that the nuclear family is the ultimate and best means of preserving independence and freedom, and that is ultimately what you have to rely on. So these are, I mean, not that I wish that we have this virus. I can't wait for it to go away. But putting that aside, these are so, there's always a social consequence of any major event like this, whether it be a war or a depression. And in this case, there could be some very positive consequences. But Alex, let's go back to the talk about schools. There has been, and Sam Blumenfeld named it perfectly, there has been a conscious conspiracy going all the way back to the dawn of the 20th century to transfer the American public school system from one by which young people are taught cognitively, they are taught to think, they're taught to become independent sovereign citizens, they're taught to self-actualize their own lives, to one that is oriented toward collectivism, behaviorism, turning the school into a collectivist experience, like a soapbox, whereas young people will learn to become a part of a bigger, and fuzzy sounding entity as a way to set it up for a new world order. And I think it was John Dewey who was one of the doyens of this radical progressive movement back in the day, who actually wrote a book where he talks about this idea of fusion as opposed to independent sovereign thinking. And that's what they're doing. That's what they've been trying to do every single decade, every single year. And they are making major strides in that direction. So, how did this all happen? I mean, parents need to understand the real nature of this school and what they're actually doing to your children.
You're right, Charles. And I think understanding the history of the public school system is so important if you want to understand what we're going through today as a society. There's a lot of mythology around the public schools, and it's not even necessarily that somebody taught this to people. It's just kind of this institution that's always been there. As long as we've been around, it's just kind of ubiquitous. It's the thing to do. When your child reaches 5, 6 years old, send them off to the public school, and nobody's put much thought into, well, where did this come from? And when we always had a public school system, one of the many things that I learned from Sam is the history of the public school system. He wrote an incredible book called "Is Public Education Necessary?" where he traces the roots back. Aside from Plato, the totalitarian who wanted the philosopher kings to micromanage all of our lives and the government should shape the minds of all the children, the first guy to seriously propose that in modern times was a communist by the name of Robert Owen. Oh, there you go, right? Fantastic book there. I can't recommend it highly enough. And so Robert Owen, Sam talks about this Robert Owen, and I knew about Robert Owen. I knew about his silly commune in Indiana called New Harmony. And I knew that it was bad news. But what Sam shines the light on is that, after this ridiculous experiment in communism failed, the guy Robert Owen got the totally wrong idea about what went wrong. It wasn't, well, hey, communism is dumb. We need to have private property rights. We need to have the nuclear family. Otherwise, things don't work. It was, I know the problem. We didn't get to brainwash these children from the time they were 2 years old so that they'd understand they need to be good little collectivists and work for the greater good of society rather than for their own individualistic motives. And, he came away with these ideas. He wrote all these essays. And what Sam documented, which as far as I know, nobody else has even talked about this. I learned all this from Sam's book, and I've never seen it anywhere else except in the references that he has from, the 1800s. The ambassador to Prussia picked up some of these essays that Robert Owen had written and decided to implement them in Prussia, creating the first modern day government education system in the world. Horace Mann, and again, Robert Owen was a communist. We need to be clear.
Yes,
He
he
was a
was.
communist who rejected God, rejected private property, rejected the family. So the Prussians implement this, and then Horace Mann, a humanist who rejected God, who rejected private property, who rejected individual liberty, who wanted to equalize all men using the government school system, went over to Prussia, brought these ideas to the United States, first in Massachusetts, and then like an evangelist went all across the country promoting this idea that the government ought to educate children. Total disaster. And then in the beginning of early 1900s, John Dewey picked up where they had left off. He actually started in the late 1800s, but really found more success in the early 1900s. And the amazing thing about all this is that none of this is secret, right? I mean, you can go read what John Dewey wrote, and he was very clear. The purpose of what I'm doing is to reshape the minds of the American people. We don't want them to be individual thinkers and individualists and little capitalists. We want them to be collectivists. So he went to the Soviet Union. He loved what was going on there. got funding from the Rockefellers to start an experimental school at the University of Chicago. And, how could we expect anything other than what we're seeing from an indoctrination system set up by men who hated or rejected God, hated or rejected individual liberty, hated or rejected private property? How could we expect anything other than what we're seeing? A nation now of dumbed down, illiterate zombies out there literally waging war, serving as kind of the battering ram in the war against our nation. Once you know the history of public schools, you know that a lot of people say they're broken. Oh, we got to fix them. They got to be reformed. They're working exactly as intended. Okay. And that's the thing that people struggle to understand. That's what Sam used to say. We've got this idea that we can fix the schools, but we've got it wrong. They're doing exactly what the creators of the system intended it to do. And so, you're not going to fix something that's working. We've got to get the children out and then rebuild education from a solid foundation, not designed by collectivists and rejectors of individual liberty.
Yes, and by the way, it's working as they intended at about $15,000 per student, paid for by the
Per year.
taxpayers. So you're
That's right.
paying for this. You don't know what's going on inside the school because they shut the parents out. They've got their they've got their techniques to do so, including intimidation. Whereas if you question the school, there's going to be consequences to your child at the school. So most parents don't do that. And that Robert Owen was a communist. He also, I think, was a contemporary of Karl Marx, and that we should note that the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848, has one of the planks being public ownership of education. Marx understood this and wrote about this, that to control humanity and to transform humanity into this international ant colony that they seek, where everyone is de facto equal and that there's no difference, you have to control children and you have to get them at the earliest age possible where they are most vulnerable, where people then can be manipulated, where their minds can be influenced, where they can be, in a sense, if you use a Marxist understanding, recreated. I mean, don't forget, Marxism believes they don't recognize the objective existence of God's creation, of reality. They believe that everything is a construct, it's a social construct, that Marx wrote about so called false consciousness, that, these institutions like faith, family, nationhood, property, love, loyalty. These things were created by exploiters to manipulate and control the masses, and thus the enlightened Marxists are supposed to come along and overthrow these things and redefine them, so that everybody can become free in some kind of a utopia that would be so evil and so bizarre. If it couldn't happen anyways, it's impossible, but right? That we can't even imagine what it would be like, because in order to be de facto equal, you'd have to become a robot. You would have
That's
to give up
exactly
your
right.
mind. You'd have to give up everything that makes you naturally unequal. We're all unequal de facto. We're equal because we're born equal and we die equal and we're equal under God. But in this brief time on earth, we are not equals. We have different levels of skill. I mean, I can't hit a baseball as good as Carl Yastrzemski. I mean, it's just the way it goes. So, we're looking at the way nature exists, and they want to undo nature and create this unnatural entity. And this bizarre. I mean, we could talk about what motivates such a bizarre movement and why they are so absolutely zealous in their quest to do this. I think it's because of this intoxicating idea that you can overthrow God and you can overthrow nature and be God, basically, and control the planet. And it's a very alluring idea. You're not just you become bigger than yourself. It's collectivism is the wolf pack. It is the mob. It's what the founding fathers tried to prevent when they created a constitution. And there's something very exciting and invigorating about being a part of a mob. You don't have to think for yourself anymore. You just sort of become part of something bigger. And younger people are particularly attracted to this, which is why younger people and college age people often were the main foot soldiers of both the communist and the Nazi parties in their respective countries.
Yeah.
So
So many important points there, Charles. And I think you just explained Marxism so perfectly. When you actually boil down the principles that Marx was promoting, they are, in essence, a total and complete repudiation of everything that God revealed in the Old and New Testaments. So, I mean, you can even just start with the basics, the Ten Commandments, right? God said, "Thou shalt not murder." And so, what do Marxists do? They murder as many people as they think necessary to bring about their utopia. I mean, Marx was very open about his genocidal plans. He thought, for example, the Scottish Highlanders, they hadn't even reached the capitalist stage, and so just wipe them out. That's it. The human life has no intrinsic value. If they're in the way of communist utopia and revolution, just get rid of them, right? Then, of course, thou shalt not steal. Very basic principle that even a little child can understand. What do the Marxists say? Well, you can't have private property. We're going to steal everything, and then we're going to redistribute it in a better way. And it hits right on what you said about free people and equal people, right? Free people cannot be equal, and equal people cannot be free. If you're free, some of us are going to work 100 hours a week and earn more money. Some of us are going to choose to work 20 hours a week. Some of us are going to be naturally very smart. Some of us will be naturally very strong. Others not so much. And so, people are different. God designed people differently. It's just an intrinsic part of the human experience, which Marxists want to abolish. Then you have covetousness, right? Marxism is at its core a religious view based on hate and covetousness. Oh, those bourgeoisie, they have nicer houses, they have better cars. We should steal it from them. We want it so much that we should send armed men to their house and take it away from them for the good of the people, right? Which really means for the good of us. So, there's actually a very good book on this subject. Unfortunately, it's so expensive. It's like $900 right now. I guess there's not enough copies in circulation, but it's called Marx and Satan. And it was written by a Romanian pastor who was in prison for 9 years and
yes,
tortured in a Romanian
Wombrand.
gulag. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, Father
Um,
Wombrand. I read that. It's fantastic.
it's brilliant. And what he
Yeah.
explains, he goes through Marx's poetry, and what he shows, Marx liked to pretend that he was an atheist who was just aloof and religion's the opiate of the masses. What he really was, I mean, he recognized that God existed, but he hated God. And I think you summarized it perfectly, Charles, where you explained that these people, they think they're going to be better than God. They think they're going to rebel and be above God. And that's what they're trying to do. It's a satanic, evil movement. And a lot of these young people who've gotten caught up into it, whether through indoctrination or ignorance or a combination of the two, don't recognize that all these things they take for granted, like the prosperity, like the peace, the rule of law in our country, all those will disappear if we jump on board with this movement. So the stakes could not be higher. And I would argue that the public school system is the primary transmission belt of these subversive, evil ideas into the public mind.
Whitaker Chambers, the author of Witness, who was an American communist spy in the 1930s and who broke with the party mainly because he became Christian and then finally went and turned state's evidence over to the Roosevelt administration in the person of Adolf Berle in 1939 when Hitler and Stalin, their alliance became public, and he realized that the people he was handling in the government, including Undersecretary of State Alger Hiss and Undersecretary of Treasury Harry Dexter White, and several other highly placed people, that they were working for both Hitler and Stalin. That was a breaking point for him, which is why he turned state's evidence. His biography, Witness, is one of the very best books that you can get. Also, a little difficult to get these days. Should be read by every high school kid. It really should be on the required reading list. And in his introduction, with his letters to his children, he points out that communism is the world's second oldest religion. He says that communism was created in the Garden of Eden when Eve was tempted to partake of the forbidden fruit, the fruit that would give her the serpent, who is classically represents Satan, said that you can be as God, you can know good and evil, you can know everything, you could basically overthrow God in heaven. And then, of course, Eve entered into the first conspiracy when she brought Adam into the gig, and then together they did it, and then of course they were punished and banished from the Garden of Eden, and we've been in exile ever since. And I think that it's safe to say that the same conspiracy to overthrow God and to be as God, to know good and evil, to have this elite that thinks that they have all knowing knowledge that gives them some kind of a moral authority to control the rest of us, has occurred in every generation ever since. This is not new. I mean, the Bible is filled with it. I mean, the conspiracy by Nimrod to build a tower to heaven so he could
Yeah,
take out a sword and kill God and cut his head off, and then take him down to prison in Earth. You know, God struck the tower down, and he scattered the people below to the four corners of the world, giving them different languages. That was the founding of separate nations. That was the answer to that conspiracy. And it's occurred in every generation since. I mean, the whole Bible is all about the struggle with the Israelites within their own lives between the temptations of evil, which is idol worship, and all of the practices that went with idol worship. It was more than a lie, it involved an immoral existence and the move toward God, you know, toward knowing God. And every time they'd move toward God, they would have prosperity and they become spiritual. And every time they moved away from God, everything would disintegrate and everything
that's
would
right.
go bad, right? And
Yeah,
this is the tension that runs through the entire narrative. And it's the same tension today, except now,
that's right.
bringing things up to 2020, now we have technologies that can play a very insidious role. And of course, these technologies are both wonderful and evil, depending upon who's handling them. You know, I would give the example of the fact that technologies were used in a good way to help elect Donald Trump president of the United States. You know, he understood social network. You know, people were able to communicate with each other. They were able to promote ideas that led to more freedom. They were able to raise consciousness of the American people with regard to the threat to freedom. And then he won. And the reaction has been to try to destroy that movement and him ever since. And when they failed to do that, now they're engaging in outright censorship and in canceling anyone who doesn't goose step to their point of view. That's why you have I mean, I'm surprised that my show is still here. I've been told by people who understand this that I've been shadow banned. The show should be much further along than it is. And I'm, you know, quite honestly, I'm just glad that I'm still on the air here. I don't know how long I will be. And it's getting worse. It's going to get even uglier as we approach the election. They are just simply trying to cancel everything out so that there is no opposition. And they're showing their true colors. And it's a very strong hand that they're playing because of technology. What do we do?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there, Charles. This is one of the best discussions I've had in a long time, and I want to start by picking up on the theme that you mentioned because we can bring it right back to the public school system. So John Dewey, he actually made his religion very clear. He co-wrote a document called the Humanist Manifesto, and as you read this document, you know, the striking thing is this is exactly the same lies that we have from Genesis 3:5. The idea that man can become his own little god or her own little god, that we can decide for ourselves what's good and evil. The very first plank in Dewey's Humanist Manifesto is that we religious humanists believe there is no God, that the universe is self-existing and not created, right? A direct repudiation of the very first words in Genesis, that in the beginning God created. And as you keep going through it, you see this is exactly the same deception that Adam and Eve were confronted with in the garden, right? This opportunity, this tantalizing opportunity to be like God or even to overthrow God and to become masters of our own destiny and deciders for ourselves of what is right and wrong. And everywhere and always that these ideas have been adopted, they have ended in absolute disaster. The Old Testament is filled with examples. And we're seeing that in America right now. You know, America started out as a very godly nation, a God-fearing country where the fear of the Lord was paramount. I mean, the people who came here were almost to a man, godly people. And then gradually over time, as this, you know, John Dewey's religion actually became the official religion of the United States. In 1962, 1963, the Supreme Court overthrew, you know, hundreds of years of you know, godly education in the United States and formalized. They actually established, as Justice Potter Stewart put in his dissent, they established the religion of secularism, as John Dewey would have called it, the religion of humanism, where man is God, where man is at the center of everything, rather than God, the creator of the heavens and the earth and all the people. So this same deception is now being taught to all of our children in public schools at taxpayer expense. Exactly what the founders hoped to prevent, right? The idea of a national religion that would be force fed to people with their own tax money. That is our reality today. They use ridiculous excuses, right? The lawsuit against the state of New York, there was a prayer there that had actually been written by Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. Not a sectarian prayer in any way, not controversial. Just, thank you, God. We acknowledge your blessings. We pray for your blessings over our school, our parents, our teachers. Can't have that, right? First Amendment, which says, of course, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment or religion. So the Supreme Court steps in, and then they create an illegitimate law respecting an establishment or religion, officially creating a national religion that will now be taught to all our children in public schools. When you remove God from the schools, an anti-God religion comes in, and that's what our children are being taught today, with the horrifying consequences we're seeing all around us. And I think that, to bring it back up to the social media issue, that's what we're seeing. We have now created a culture that is okay with censorship, that is okay with, and notice the points of view that they're censoring, right? They're not censoring the people who want to kill cops. They're not censoring the people who want to behead the president or overthrow the government of the United States or burn down our cities or loot our shops. Who are they censoring? They're censoring people like you, people who have intelligent, wise things to say from decades of experience, decades of study, reasoned arguments about why private property is good, why liberty is good, why we should respect God. These are the people who are finding themselves being censored. And so now it's gotten to such a point where the mainstream of our society is moving in that direction. And you're right. Technology now, unfortunately, is in the hands of evil people who intend to do evil things with it. And that means silencing people like you, people like me, people like at the New American Magazine, people who want to preserve the things that made America great. So we're heading into some dark times. The one thing that I'm encouraged with when it comes to technology is there's a lot of people on our side who are also very intelligent, who are also good with technology. And so we're seeing now alternative platforms popping up. We're seeing, new ways of getting around the censorship. We're going to need a whole lot more of that. And I think part of it too is going to have to be going back to old technology, right? If they, now they've put the ICANN into the hands of the United Nations. So if it comes to it and the internet ends up not being an effective tool to get the information out, well, we're still going to have magazines. We're still going to have AM and FM radio, hopefully. And we need to go back to what worked before: pamphlets, packets, old meeting. Unfortunately, the coronavirus has kind of put a stop to large meetings and gatherings and speeches, but hopefully that'll come back. And that may be the only way to get the truth out in the days ahead if we can't circumvent the big technology companies. So these are all things that need to be thought about right now before it's too late.
Yes, and I think it's sort of happening. I saw this morning a little article indicating that the Republican campaign has had almost 1 million visits to people's homes by canvassers, operatives, all wearing masks, knocking on doors, and talking about President Trump and Republican candidates for Congress. The Democrats have had zero. And this is just for the month of June. We don't know in July. So I think that President Trump gets this, and I think he is moving forward and doing an end run around this lockstep control of the social media. And I just wanted to briefly also comment on the business of the prayer in school, which was again a non-sectarian prayer. One did not have to do it; they could simply excuse themselves. And I remember I interviewed Bill Murray, who was the son of Madeline Murray O'Hare, who was this horrendous individual who brought this lawsuit in New York. And he's become Christian. I think he's a minister. I should call him back. He's a very interesting guy. Um, but he pointed out that the Constitution, the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court took that case was unconstitutional. It was not their jurisdiction. That is a state question. States have a right to regulate those issues of prayer. And I mean, I think I'm actually old enough to remember when that went through in 1962, I believe. And President Kennedy was shocked, and he got on and said, "This is a very sad day for America." It really did change a lot of the orientation of this country, and it de facto did make secular humanism the official religion of the country and the only religion that would be allowed to be promoted on the public square. Unfortunately, religions such as Judaism and Catholicism and many Protestant mainline churches, they've gone along with it because they've been infiltrated. I don't know if you've talked about this, but the National Council of Churches and
Yep.
some of the Jewish establishment is horrendous, but I don't get into that. But they're just completely, cowed by this movement. They
Yep.
have lost their moral rudder. And it's not something that happened overnight. I mean, John Dewey and the rest of them, they are and were what I would call Fabian socialists.
Hmm.
They didn't want to have a communist revolution like the Bolshevik Revolution because they knew that wouldn't work in this country. So they did it incrementally, and they take a very long view. That's why the symbol of the Fabian movement is the tortoise. They look at it in increments of decades, if not centuries, of changing the way we are, moving us back, retarding the human race into a becoming human resources, losing our consciousness of who we are. And they infiltrate our institutions. They rise up slowly through a rat line. They get rid of slowly the people that stand in the way, and in a way that you don't even notice it. They've certainly taken over the academe. Certainly even on the college level. I mean, there was just an article in Boston Magazine which showed that there's surprising how honest it was, that Boston and Massachusetts, my state, is like 98% liberals for professors. I mean, it's just they've completely and utterly taken over. And if you don't genuflect in their direction, I think young people, to the degree that they have any scintilla of consciousness when they enter college, when they, and faith, they get the message pretty quickly that they're to subsume that and get along, because otherwise they're not going to get through. And, look, it's part of human nature that we all go the path of least resistance. Nobody wants to have to be attacked and be accused of having something against someone based on race or whatever the present attack is. So you put it into your subconscious. You don't think about it anymore. You become part of this system, and it's the only way to get along. It's the only way to meet people. It's the only way to get success. Your parents are spending 50 grand a year for this. You don't want to get kicked out of school. So I think that it's really become almost a hermetically sealed system now in this country, where there is just very, very little resistance, and the resistance that's there is usually somewhat vapid and somewhat stripped of actual content.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's very sad. It took multiple generations of this indoctrination, of this deliberate dumbing down of America to get us to this point. And I think people instinctively feel like something's wrong. If you talk to your average person, if you look at the polling data, Americans, they disagree on all kinds of stuff, but they're almost all in agreement that we're moving in the wrong direction as a nation. We see our infrastructure crumbling. We see our young people hating the family, hating God, hating our civilization, our churches, our nation, our synagogues, our values, our individual liberty. Um, and they don't really understand what went wrong, and they don't understand what the solutions are either. A lot of things, oh, we'll just elect the right Republican, or we'll just elect the right Democrat, and everything's going to get fixed. I mean, the rot now has gotten into our nation so deep that turning this around is going to require a Herculean effort or divine intervention, or maybe both. But I think it really begins with recognizing, first of all, that we have a problem, recognizing that our nation is at war, not by our own choice. The war has been declared on us, and unfortunately, your average mainstream everyday American doesn't even realize that they're in a war yet. They don't realize that their children are being conscripted into a war against their nation and their church and their synagogue and their liberty and their constitution. So it's going to be a long process, and I hope we don't have to go too far down the road that so many other nations have traveled down before we recognize the problem. Soviet Union, China, Nazi Germany, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea. Just pick your nation that fell under totalitarianism. I hope we don't have to go too far along that road. But unfortunately, we are moving down that road very quickly. And give it another generation of this, and I don't know how we'll be able to turn it around. And I warn people, this is not a game. once we lose our liberty, once it's gone, it's not going to come back in your lifetime. There's not going to be some, militia that's going to come and overthrow the tide. It's just not going to happen. They've been working on this so long. They've corrupted the minds, the hearts, the morals of our children. It's going to be a long-term effort. There is no silver bullet. Anybody who's telling you that, we're just going to save America by having a con and adopting a few amendments. I mean, come on. I mean, the rot is so deep now. The movement to turn this around is going to have to be systemic. And I think it really begins with parents recognizing, I'm not going to subject my children to that. I'm going to make sure they have a decent education, whether that be through homeschooling or putting them in a Christian school or a yeshiva or a co-op. There's a lot of options out there now, but I think it's going to have to begin with parents taking charge of the upbringing of their children and saying, no, you're not going to brainwash my children to be little socialists, little humanists, little anti-God zombies. I'm going to take charge of their education, and I'm going to educate them to be critical thinkers, to fear the Lord, to have an understanding of our civilization, to read history, to understand science. I'm going to educate them to be well-rounded citizens who can govern themselves. And that, I think, is really going to be the slow process toward moving us forward, if it's even possible.
It's kind of a counter Fabian movement,
right?
In a way, we're counter revolutionaries,
Mm-hmm.
and the problem that you're describing, Alex, and I would describe, it's more of a social problem than a political problem.
Yeah.
It's not that you're going to get some person showing up on a white knight to save us all. That's what they do. It's more that we have to understand it as people, and of course we have stronger weapons on our side. Ultimately, we have the truth.
Yeah.
We have, self-interest as opposed to sacrificing your interest. We have the basic and natural elements that make human beings who they are, and those can be arrayed against those who want to create an unnatural human being. And I think every so often you do have a person step up to the plate and take a swing. And I think one of those people is Donald Trump. It's incredible. He is, that's why they despise him as much as they do. He's threatening to wake up the beast. He's threatening to make us woke in the real sense, right? He is, he's talking about the importance of things that in the past politicians might have given lip service to, but everyone knew they were lying. Things like putting the nation first, preserving the national border, returning power to the citizen as opposed to this rotten bureaucracy, which he has said is both permeates Democrats and Republicans, and he's run against both. And it's an incredible movement, and it's one that I mean, I'm amazed that he's doing this. I mean, it's almost like I pray for him, and for his safety, frankly.
Yep.
And what makes him get up and do this fight? It's an amazing thing to watch, and I think that you have someone like that every so often who is willing to step up. You are one of those people, Alex. It's very difficult to reach people, but even if you just reach a few people at a time, you know, when you pierce the veil of this falsity and this phony existence, and you reach someone, it's forever. You can't go back. So, I mean, I feel optimistic, and as we were talking about, I feel that there are some positive elements that may emerge out of this virus. I mean, speaking of which, when you say that we could move rapidly in the direction of a communist or a Nazi society, people don't dismiss that. That's something that I think that even a year ago people might have said, nah, that could never happen in America. But I think that now that we've seen what's happened this year, first of all, with the virus, and I'm not saying that, I'm not getting into whether or not it was created in a Chinese lab. We don't know that. I don't know that. It doesn't matter, really. The fact of the matter is that we can look at how the establishment has handled the virus in a way to see that they've engaged in a national, and even an international social experiment to get people to basically live under a state of martial law and to affect certain behaviors that are not particularly scientific, and that there are drugs that can help treat this virus. We're not going to mention the name of one of those drugs, because if we do, I will lose the show,
Right.
which I think should tell us everything we need to know. It's a drug that's being used very effectively in France, in Italy, in Israel, in Taiwan, Central American countries, but we can't talk about it here because, if you do, you're going to get everything is, they'll pull the plug on you. To me, that says everything we need to know, not about the virus itself, which is a disease and we should be careful, but about how the establishment in this country is handling it in a very totalitarian way. And now we have communist revolutions in major cities, burning black neighborhoods, looting black businesses, killing black people, destroying black neighborhoods, which have struggled to emerge after many, many decades of leftist policies that have destroyed their families, destroyed their entrepreneurialism, destroyed their church, and destroyed their education. And we're told that this is somehow supposed to help minorities, and that if you criticize it, you have something against minorities, which of course is the cardinal sin, and which is a big fat lie as well, I would point out. So these things occurring in our as we watch, I mean, right in front of us, are all the proof that we need that what you're saying, Alex, is absolutely right. We can be moving very rapidly toward an authoritarian system. It isn't that going to take that much to push us there forward. And we see people around us. You probably see these people. I definitely see them who are, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but they don't understand what's going on. They've been sucked into this whole narrative, and they're part of the problem de facto, even if they don't think they are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Charles. And when you look at the polling data, the dire predicament that we're in, I think really becomes clear. My generation, 70% of millennials say they're socialists and they're going to vote for a socialist candidate. What do you do with that? How do you reverse something like that? It's possible, yes, but it's going to be an enormous task. And like you, there's some things that I'm really optimistic about. The fact that Trump could even get elected, I think, is a good reason to be optimistic.
Yeah.
You had every media outlet, every major media outlet in this country constantly demonizing him and trying to tear him down and calling him every name that you could imagine. He's a racist, he's a homophobe, he's a bigot, he's an anti-Semite, he's any nasty thing they could think of to call him, they called him times 100. And yet somehow the American people still went out and voted in massive numbers to make him the president of the United States. And now he's really moving the Overton window, right? During his 4th of July speech, his Independence Day speech at Mount Rushmore, he said the reason for the mayhem in our streets is that our young people have been indoctrinated. They're being taught to hate America against every law of nature and society. They're being taught to hate their own nation. Their heroes are being demonized with lies. So he hit the nail on the head. And right now, he's the big cheese. He's the president of the United States. So, big things can happen. And yeah, he's under tremendous pressure. And yeah, the media is painting him as some kind of monster, but he's in there. He's doing good things. He's got a lot of support across this country. I just drove up and down the East Coast. As soon as you get outside of the cities, there's Trump flags, there's Trump signs all over this country. And that's not because everybody thinks he's a perfect human being and he's an angel and he's going to come save us. It's because people are tired of the lies, of the beating down of America, of the effort to dismantle our society. So those are really encouraging things. And again, it comes back to education and seeing through the phony reality that has been created for us. And we got a lot of work to do, and there's no sense in pretending like everything is well. It's obviously not. Again, when you look at the polling data for the young people, it's clear that we are on a very dangerous trajectory. 70% of Americans, young people, millennials, socialists, that's probably a higher percentage than they had in Cuba. That's probably a higher percentage than they had in the Soviet Union when the communists took over. Mm-hmm. So they have really eroded the foundations that America was built on, but it is possible to rebuild them. And as you mentioned, Charles, we've got very powerful weapons on our side, including the truth, which, even if you don't have a lot of money, the truth can stand on its own. We've got, an innate human desire for liberty. People don't want to be slaves, even if they're misled. There is a sense that I want to control my own life to the largest extent possible. I want to be able to say what I think. I want to be able to think and control my own mind. So we have these very powerful things on our side as well. And I think ultimately, the battle's going to get intense. Things may turn sour in the years ahead, but there's no reason to lose hope. And we have got to keep fighting this thing. Our children, their future, our grandchildren, our liberty, our nation, it's all on the line here. And so, if you're sitting at home thinking somebody else is going to fight the battle for you, recognize that nobody else is going to do it for you. You've got to get involved. And now would be a very good time to start if you haven't started yet. So.
Alex, very important conversation. and I really appreciate you joining me today, as always. Let my viewers and listeners know where they can get more information about you and your work and your books and your articles.
Yeah, well, thank you so much again for having me. It's always a pleasure to come on. I think you're one of the most insightful hosts out there right now. Just the
Thank
depth
you.
of the conversation is so much more than you get in traditional media. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Most of my work goes at the New American. You can subscribe to the print magazine if you haven't yet. If you want this special report we did on rescuing our children, it's thenewamerican.com/rescuing our children. I've also got my own personal blog. It's libertysentinel.org. I write now for the Epic Times, WorldNet Daily, Freedom Project Media, lots of different publications when I have time. Really involved now in this public school thing. We've got a new ministry called Public School Exit, where we're trying to help parents get their children out, regardless of what barriers may be there. If you put my name into a search engine other than Google, you'll find a lot of stuff. And thank you once again, Charles. I hope people will share this interview. Subscribe to this show, hit the little bell so that when a new video comes out, you'll be notified. And
Hmm.
share this with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family. This is the kind of information, the kind of discussion that America needs to be having. You're not going to see it on the television. So, help out with this. And thank you again for having me, Charles. Always a pleasure. Really, really appreciate it.
All right, Alex. Thanks a lot. Have a great afternoon. God
You also.
bless.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And God bless you too.
Thank you.